What's got 4 wheels, 2 faces, and an engine that produces more power per litre than a Lamborghini Aventador S? The Honda S2000. Here's a detailed history of it. The story of the Honda S2000 begins in 1995. However, I want to momentarily talk about the 25th of October 1962. On this day, the Honda Motor Company unveiled their first production car. And it was a Roadster. And it was rear-wheel drive. And it had a red line at over 9,000 RPM. Sound familiar? Back to 1995, and to the Tokyo Motor Show, and Honda unveiled this, the Sports Study Model concept car. Designed by Pininfarina, the same Italian styling house that designed cars such as the Ferrari Enzo, the Fiat 124 Spider, and the F40. A particularly cool design feature on this concept were the wraparound twin cockpits that encased the driver and passenger. The car was developed at Honda's Wako Design Center near Tokyo and featured a 2-litre, 5-cylinder VTEC engine, semi-automatic transmission derived from the Honda NSX, and suspension, also borrowed from the NSX. Honda said that the concept car was capable of 155 miles an hour. The concept was met with a highly enthusiastic reception. However, Honda weren't snappish about taking it to production. They took 3 years to crunch the numbers and develop the road car, and testing of the later prototype even involved some rapid laps around the Nürburgring Nordschleife, driven by legendary Japanese race driver Gansan. Gansan stated that he felt the S2000 prototype was actually faster than the NSX, which of course was still very much in production. Honda finally unveiled the S2000 to the world on the 24th of September 1998. Exactly 50 years to the day from when the Honda Motor Company was founded. When the car was announced, its assigned name was no surprise, as it followed the same formula as the Honda Roadsters that had preceded it. The letter S, which stands for sports, and the 2000, which stands for the engine's displacement, or at least the closest round number to the engine's actual displacement. The Honda S500 had a 531cc engine, and the S2000's engine is 3cc short of the full 2000. But I'm glad they rounded up, because the Honda S1997 just doesn't have the same ring to it. Now, as you can see, there were several changes to the car's aesthetics from the sports study model concept upon which it was based. That's because Honda designer Daisuke Sawai was tasked with refining the car aesthetically, ensuring it was fit and legal for worldwide road use. The front lights were raised to meet safety standards, and the rear lights were enlarged. Of course, the enclosed cockpits were scrapped in the pursuit of practicality, and a much needed folding roof was added to the car too. However, in my opinion, Mr. Sawai did an excellent job in keeping much of the revered concept car's aesthetic charm, including the simple yet elegant shape, the driver-focused dashboard layout that didn't even include a clock on the pre-2001 models because race cars don't have clocks, and fortunately, the lovely red engine start button, which gives a wonderful sense of occasion every time you start the car, even if you do have to put the keys in the ignition and turn them before pressing the button anyway. A design revision that perhaps wasn't so popular was that the S2000 was a bit bigger than the sports study model. At 4,120mm in length, the car is 135mm longer than the concept, and at 1,750mm wide, it's also 55mm wider than the SSM. However, compared to its rivals, it's a perfectly acceptable size. Whilst it is slightly longer than the Audi TT, it's shorter than the Porsche 986 Boxster, and narrower than both. Now, push to start is great fun, and having a narrow body is certainly useful when trying to fit your S2000 into a small parking space, but it's all pointless if the car's no good to drive. Fortunately, however, the Honda S2000 has some pretty clever components under its skin to ensure you have a blast every time you take it out for a blast. The chassis is pretty cool, because Honda designed it to have none of the inherent flaws that a soft-top convertible usually does. Here's the classic problem with convertibles. Let's say this shoebox is a car, and the lid is the car's roof. When the roof is on the car, it doesn't twist and bend much, because it's got an extra connection providing rigidity at the top of the car. However, in a convertible, you don't have that solid and connected roof, meaning the car is much more twistable and bendable. So, how did Honda get around this notorious convertible issue? By designing the S2000 what's called a high X-bone frame. It's called an X-bone frame because, well, it sort of looks like an X. Really, it looks much more like if two tuning forks shared a single handle. The stem in the centre goes right between the driver and passenger and is high enough to essentially act as an armrest for them. The two forks at each end of the car are at the same height as the centre chassis stem. According to Honda, this is what gives the S2000, a convertible, as much structural rigidity as a saloon car, without the need for a solid roof to be a part of the frame. The car also has chassis side members attached to all this, which again contributes to the stiffness. However, the chassis does have a fair flaw. It's incredibly highly strung. What I mean by that is if you damage it, it's considered nearly impossible to fix back to 100%. It's a notorious factor of S2000 ownership. In fact, even when the car was made, the X-frame had to be put together by a special hot plate template machine controlled by robots, because even Honda's Takumi, which is a name given to master craftspersons in Japan, a title not given lightly, couldn't weld the X-bone frame together without it warping and twisting. Of course, the frame isn't going to twist or break if you hit a pothole or similar, it's perfectly strong. But if you get into an accident and you find you've damaged your S2000's chassis, it may be time to start looking for a new car, even if it's the kind of damage that could be fully repaired on other cars. It's not just the chassis that gives the S2000 its precise handling. The car also utilises double wishbone suspension, which allows the car to have less body roll. The car also has a Torsen limited slip differential to aid its cornering ability, similar to the GT86, some models of the MX-5 Mark I and Mark II, the Lancia Delta Integrale, and the Mark III and Mark IV Toyota Supras. Of course, there's one thing that contributes to a car's handling more than possibly anything else: the weight. The Honda S2000 has a very respectable curb weight of 1,260 kilograms. That's 35 kilograms lighter than the 2001 Porsche 986 Boxster S, 100 kilograms lighter than the BMW Z3 3-litre Sport, and a whopping 255 kilograms lighter than the Audi TT Turbo Quattro Roadster. Just as important is how the weight is distributed in the car. The S2000 has a 49.2 to 50.8% weight distribution, meaning that the car has near perfect balance between its front and rear. Honda achieved this by moving the engine as far back into the car as possible. Even though the car has that enormous bonnet protruding out in front of it, the entire engine is behind the front wheels, meaning that the S2000 is a mid-engined car. Now you may be wondering, wouldn't a 50-50 weight distribution be better? And I wondered that too, but Honda evidently felt that this slightly rear weight bias suited the car and chose this weight distribution rather than an even 50-50. This is clear because whilst all other panels on the car are steel, the bonnet on the S2000 is made of aluminium, as to shed weight specifically on the front half of the car, where the weight distribution is slightly negative. If Honda had been really keen to get closer to that 50-50, they could have used a steel bonnet instead to add a touch of weight to the front. Of course, this also would have heightened the car's centre of gravity, which may well have been a consideration too. So a lightweight aluminium bonnet was the best all-round solution. Of course, you'll only experience how light the S2000's bonnet is by lifting it, at which point you won't care much, because you'll be looking at the car's crowning jewel, the most famous component of the S2000, and argued by some as one of the finest creations Honda has ever engineered. The engine. Named the F20C, this is a 2-litre inline-4 VTEC motor with some stats that are still incredible even today. Its redline is at 9,000 RPM, and it revs to 9,200 RPM. It produces around 236 horsepower for the Australian, European, Canadian and American domestic markets. However, for the Japanese domestic market, it produces approximately 247 horsepower. At the time of release, the Honda S2000's engine produced the highest number of horsepower per litre of displacement of any naturally aspirated production car ever, with 123.5 horsepower per litre. In fact, it held on to this record all the way until 2009, when Ferrari released the 458, which had a 4.5 litre V8 engine that produced 562 horsepower, meaning that it produced 125 horsepower per litre, just enough to dethrone a car that when new cost £130,000 less than it. The Honda F20C engine accomplishes this feat by employing two key tactics. Firstly, the engine works hard. The crazy high redline, plus the fact that VTEC only kicks in somewhere between 5,500 RPM and 6,000 RPM, means that it's made to produce its power far along the tachometer. The engine also has excellent compression, meaning that its pistons can squeeze the air in the cylinder more than most petrol engines. The more you squeeze the air, the bigger the bang when the spark, fuel and air mix, which of course means more power. In order to cope with this hard work, the engine is very, very well made. It has forged pistons, connecting rods, and a forged crankshaft to ensure that they don't fail under stress. This makes the car very popular with tuners, as it's noted that the engine's internals can handle over 500 horsepower. That being said, the limited slip differential would most likely fail under that much power. The second key tactic the engine uses is making sure all its hard work goes as far as possible. Honda did this by reducing as much weight and friction from the engine's internals as they could. The previously mentioned connecting rods were made exclusively for the F20C engine and were designed to be as light as possible. The cylinder block was made of aluminium, and the cylinder walls, as well as the piston skirts, were made using a carbon fibre and aluminium mix. This material is both strong and very low friction, meaning that the pistons lose less energy when being pushed down along the cylinder walls. All of this means that the engine is working against itself as little as possible, and therefore the energy produced by the explosions is going to the wheels, rather than being lost before it leaves the motor. So, after this segment talking about all the incredible engineering and high quality components that went into the S2000, it may be a bit of a surprise to you to hear that it was actually met with very mixed reviews. Not everyone was smitten with the S2000. People complained that the car was too snappy in the way that it cornered, and it was particularly prone to oversteer. It's understandable. The car's rear suspension and steering setup was stiffer than a pensioner post-marathon. Other people loved this about the car, as it contributed to the S2000's racy feel. However, it was considered a tad dangerous, particularly to inexperienced drivers. The second complaint came primarily from the American market, and was about the S2000's engine. Many people loved the F20C engine, however others felt that the power and torque were just too far up the rev range, making the car feel too slow before 5,000 RPM. Critics complained that before the high revs the car felt like a Mazda MX-5. An excellent car, but much slower and cheaper than the market of cars the S2000 was a part of. The 2002 model year saw changes made to the S2000's suspension and anti-roll bar setup, in an attempt to make the car more predictable at the limit. However, the complaints were properly addressed when the car underwent its 2004 facelift. In 2004, Honda made a number of significant changes to make the S2000 easier to drive. The springs on the rear of the car were made 10% softer, whilst on the front they were actually made 7% harder. The car's dampers and overall suspension geometry were also adjusted to account for this, and the rear stabilizer bar was reduced in diameter by 1.8mm in order to improve cornering too. The facelift also brought new wheels and tyres that were bigger in diameter and wider than the previous ones. Honda say these changes were a key factor in increasing the 2004 car's cornering limits. They also made some upgrades to the chassis, reinforcing it and strengthening it, which, now that we know how hard they are to fix if damaged, is certainly no bad thing. The slight downside to these reinforcements is that the car's weight increased by 25 kilograms to 1,285 kilograms. Honda listened to their American buyers and also made a significant change to the engine, exclusively for the US market. The F22C1 engine had an extra 160cc of displacement and a slightly adjusted configuration to improve its torque output. The engine now made 162 pound-feet of torque, 9 more than the previous American market engine, and it arrived a whole 1000 RPM earlier than the F20C motor. The engine maintained its 236 horsepower, however it too arrived earlier, hitting the max power output at 7,800 RPM as opposed to 8,300 RPM. Much like the chassis, however, there was a downside to this too. The increased displacement meant more stress at high revs, and in order to maintain dependability, the engine's redline and rev limit were reduced by 1000 RPM to 8,000 and 8,200 RPM respectively. No more 9,000. As said before, the engine was made exclusively for the US market. Australian, European and Japanese S2000s kept the 9,200 RPM F20C engine. However, in 2006, Honda did introduce the torquier engine to the Japanese market, but because the previous JDM S2000 engine was already running higher compression than the other market's engines, which this larger displacement engine could no longer safely do, whilst the car's torque increased by a substantial 12 pound-feet, its power was reduced by a significant 11 horsepower. 2004 also saw improvements made to the brakes. The brake pads were coated in a new metallic compound to reduce fade and improve stopping power. Of course, being just brake pads, a disposable component, there's no real reason why pre-facelift S2000s couldn't adopt this improvement simply by upgrading their own brake pads on their next service. The ABS system was changed for improved stability, whilst also being smaller and lighter. Reinforcements were also made to the clutch, the transmission, and the limited slip differential, which is always good news. And of course, a facelift can't be called a facelift without changes to the face. The nose of the car has possibly the most obvious changes, with the 2 nostrils removed and the centre grille expanded. The headlights were revised slightly and were given HID light technology for a much stronger beam. The rear lights were altered slightly too and were fitted with LED bulbs. The rear bumper on the car was also redesigned to appear slightly lower, and the shape of the exhaust tailpipes protruding out from underneath the rear bumper were changed from circles to ovals. All these changes were implemented primarily with the intention of making the car look more aggressive, and I believe Honda succeeded. But beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and which S2000 looks better is very much a case of personal preference. In fact, the facelift brought many changes that allowed people to exercise their personal preference. If prospective purchasers wanted super sharp and racy handling, they could go for a pre-facelift, but if they wanted a slightly easier drive, they could go for a facelift model. In America, if they wanted a super high revving and slightly harder work engine, they could go for a pre-facelift, but if they wanted a slightly less revvy, but better general use engine, they could go for the facelift. And if people wanted a more friendly and simple looking car, they could go for the pre-facelift, but if they wanted a more aggressive and mean aesthetic, the facelift was the way to go. When you hear people talking about pre-facelift versus facelift S2000s, you may hear them refer to the cars as AP1 and AP2 cars. If you're in America, this is correct, but if you're anywhere else in the world, it's time to break out the actually, because AP1 and AP2 refer to the engine designation, which as we know only changed in America in 2004 and Japan in 2006. In the UK, the S2000s had the same engine throughout, and therefore maintained the AP1 chassis designation throughout too. So outside the US, it's standard and correct to refer to the pre- and post-facelift cars as pre-facelift and post-facelift cars. But regardless of what S2000 you bought and where you bought it, it was a well-made machine. However, where your S2000 was made was dependent on the model year of the car. Before 2005, the S2000 was being made at Honda's Tochigi plant, around 80 miles north of Tokyo. This was pretty cool, as the Tochigi plant was Honda's R&D centre, and the S2000, the legendary Honda NSX, and the rather special Honda Insight were the only cars being built at this state-of-the-art facility where, according to Honda, high-tech production technology and old-time craftsmanship come together. The cars were hand-assembled and mostly hand-welded, which makes each S2000's inception a bit more special than a standard Honda's, and gives pre-2005 S2000 owners some extra bragging rights too. From 2005 onwards, the S2000's production was moved to the large Suzuka factory, where hand assembly and welding were still technically used, but to a lesser extent, as the larger and more efficient production line allowed for a wider use of robots and automated production. If you've got an S2000, you can easily check which plant the car was made at by looking at the 17-character VIN number on the plate in the engine bay. If the 11th digit is a T, the car was made in Tochigi. If it's an S, it was made in Suzuka. Also, I totally made up this VIN number, so if somehow it is the same as your car's, I'm sorry and don't freak out. Of course, the location of assembly is a fairly small factor when choosing what sports car to buy. Most prospective purchasers are much more interested in how the car performs in relation to its rivals. So, how does the S2000 perform? Well, let's say you lined up a UK spec Honda S2000, a Porsche 986 Boxster S, an Audi TT 1.8 Turbo Roadster, a BMW Z3 3-litre Sport, a 2004 Mazda RX-8 231 PS, and a BMW Z4 3-litre on a drag strip. From 0 to 60 miles an hour, the Honda performs pretty well. Its time of 5.8 seconds is beaten quite convincingly by the Porsche and the BMW Z4, which are 0.3 of a second ahead. However, it beats the Mazda RX-8 and the Z3 by 1/10 of a second, and the Audi TT by half a second. Over 1/4 of a mile, it's a similar story. The S2000 sets a time of 14.6 seconds. This is 0.6 of a second behind the 3.2 litre Boxster S, 0.4 of a second behind the 3 litre Z4, and is overtaken by the 3 litre Z3, which is a single 1/10 of a second faster over the 1/4 mile. The RX-8 is next behind the S2000, completing the 1/4 mile 0.2 of a second later, and the Audi again brings up the rear 0.4 of a second behind the S2000, its extra weight really proving a problem for it under acceleration. Now top speed. Of course, the 260 horsepower Porsche Boxster S takes the glory with an impressive top speed of 164 miles an hour. The 231 horsepower BMW Z4 is second with a top speed of 155 miles an hour, and then the 237 horsepower S2000 is next, with a top speed of 150 miles per hour. This is particularly interesting as the Z4 has less power than the S2000, and they have the same drag coefficient of 0.33, yet the BMW tops out 5 miles per hour faster than the Honda. The 231 horsepower Z3 is next, just 1 mile an hour behind the Honda, and finally the 221 horsepower Audi pulls itself from the bottom of the score sheet with a top speed of 147 miles an hour, beating the 227 horsepower Mazda by a single mile an hour. So if you checked out the Honda's rivals but decided the S2000 is the car you want, your next decision may well be buy a normal spec or source a special edition car. But unlike with cars such as the Mazda MX-5, where special editions are so common it's hard to find a regular version, the S2000 had very few cars with special edition trim made. As should be expected, the Japanese domestic market did best in terms of number of special trims offered, with 2 special editions. The S2000 Type V was offered from July 2000 and made a number of significant changes to the car's handling setup. It had a very clever variable gear ratio system that changed the car's steering ratio depending on how fast the car was going, meaning that it would be easier to steer at low speeds, yet more racy and precise at high speeds. In fact, its lock-to-lock steering was reduced by an entire turn, from 2.4 turns on the standard S2000 to 1.4 turns. The car was given a special steering wheel and a special badge to differentiate it aesthetically from the standard model. Then in 2008, Honda made the Type S for the Japanese market, This provided substantial changes to both the mechanics and the body of the car. Most obviously, the Type S came with a large front spoiler and a tall rear wing, providing downforce to improve high-speed stability, and of course to give it a super aggressive look. Inside, the car had yellow and black Alcantara sport seats, as well as a few other minor changes such as an aluminium shift knob with yellow lettering. It also had lightweight alloy wheels, uprated springs, dampers and anti-roll bars, plus a slightly shortened gear shift stroke. However, whilst the car was stiffer than the standard S2000, Honda were keen to make sure it was comfortable and practical enough for regular use and for enjoyment on Japan's Taurog roads. For the UK market, there was the GT trim, which was released in 2002 and doesn't really qualify as a special edition, as all it included was a removable hardtop and an exterior temperature gauge at a cost of £550 over the regular Roadster. So the only special edition offered to the UK market was the GT Edition 100, which was unveiled at the Geneva Motor Show in 2009 and released that year to commemorate the end of production. It had a Grand Prix white body, a black S2000 badge, a removable hardtop, graphite grey coloured wheels, a red interior with matching red stitching on the gear lever, and a kickplate plaque that indicated which production number the vehicle was in the series, as production was limited to just 100 units, hence the name. This special edition was also made available to the continental European market and was called the Ultimate Edition. All the changes made to the car were purely cosmetic and had no real effect on performance. The American market, however, did get a special edition that affected performance. In fact, they got the most hardcore S2000 of the lot, the Honda S2000 Club Racer. Introduced in 2008, the Club Racer had a lot in common with the Japanese market's S2000 Type S. Much like the Type S, the Club Racer was put on a diet, reducing its weight by around 45 kilograms. One of the main ways this was done was by removing the soft top entirely, making the CR not really daily driver material, although it did come with a removable aluminium hardtop. The car also had the same aero package as the Type S, and the interior with the yellow and black Alcantara seats, the spherical aluminium shift knob, and other bits and pieces such as full carbon fibre trim around the centre console. A cool little feature on the Club Racer that other S2000s don't have is a peak power indicator. This is a little light beside the speedometer that illuminates to tell you when the car is producing its maximum power. The biggest interior change that differed the Club Racer from the Type S was the air conditioning and stereo system, or lack thereof, as purchasers were able to spec their cars without these amenities in order to further save weight. This again made the CR less daily driver and more weekend warrior. The changes that made the Club Racer more race car than any, however, were to the steering and suspension. It had stiffer springs in shocks, thicker anti-sway bars, an extra brace behind the rear seats, and a quickened steering ratio. The car also had upgraded tyres, a shorter shifting gearbox, lighter wheels and a sports-tuned exhaust, giving a more aggressive sound than the standard car's setup. And all of this, according to Honda, was to maximise the S2000's potential on the racetrack. Honda apparently produced this most forceful S2000 for the American market as a token of their appreciation for the huge amount of support the car had received in the States. And Honda were right to be appreciative, as more S2000s were sold in America than anywhere else in the world, put together. In total, over 110,000 S2000s were sold globally between 1999 and 2010, and the USA accounted for just over 66,000 of those sales. Just under 20,000 S2000s were sold in Europe, and just over 21,500 S2000s were sold in Japan. In Canada, around 2,500 were sold, and in Australia, a little under 2,000 were sold over the 10-year period. Although these figures don't make the standard S2000 particularly limited, when you compare it to a car such as the Mazda MX-5 Mark II, over 134,000 of which were sold, over just 7 years, in Europe alone, the S2000 is a bit of a rarity, and because of this, values for well-kept examples have never gotten particularly low, especially for the post-facelift models. Prices of course do fluctuate depending on mileage and condition, and the cars have depreciated in value from their not so cheap £28,000 suggested retail price when new. However, the general consensus is that these cars are already slowly going up in value and are a solid investment, especially if you're able to look after them. If you are in the market to buy one, keep an eye out for rust on the wheel arches. This is a problem area on the S2000 as they are lined with plastic which in essence traps the water and dirt and is the primary cause of the rust they are trying to guard from. Fortunately, there's always enough S2000s available on the second-hand market that you'll be able to source yourself an excellent example. Perhaps you'll find one that's previously had a famous keeper. As of those 110,000 sold, a few have been owned by some pretty notable names. Hollywood star Chris Pine, aka the new Captain Kirk, has owned an S2000, and it was rumoured that the singer Bob Dylan did too. However, what makes the car more impressive are the professional race drivers and automotive journalists who have owned one. Former IndyCar and NASCAR driver Danica Patrick has owned one, and Fifth Gear presenter Vicky Butler Henderson has apparently owned a few over the years. It's always a good sign when professional race drivers own a sports car, as they are often the most discerning keepers. Former Formula 1 world champion Jenson has owned an S2000, however it was during his 10-year driving for the Honda F1 team, so it's likely it was part of his contract with the team to drive the manufacturer's car. So almost 10 years after production of the S2000 ended, the car is still adored, possibly even more so than when it was available new. It begs the question therefore, why did Honda stop making the car? Well, there's a couple of very good reasons. The first reason is really the only reason Honda needed to cease production. Money. Much like it was to many of its owners, the S2000 was a luxury to Honda. It wasn't a big money spinner for them, it was more of a look what we can make car to get people excited about the brand and into the showrooms. Unfortunately, however, when times get tough and companies have to tighten the purse strings, these luxuries are the first to go. And when the 2008 automotive industry financial crisis hit, Honda had to put future plans for the S2000 on hold and start wrapping up production in order to focus on the production of more profitable cars. In addition to this, the S2000, which wasn't the most frugal in terms of fuel usage, was beginning to close in on falling short of ever-tightening emissions regulations. It's because of this that UK S2000s produced after the 23rd of March 2006 cost £540 a year to tax. Before this they had cost £315 from 2001, and before that they cost £255. This steep increase in ownership costs of course meant the car was also less appealing to new owners, and this showed as sale figures began to slide in the S2000's latter years. So what about the future? Well, the internet is abundant with rumours of incoming S2000 successors, but it looks like for the foreseeable future they will remain just rumours. We very recently passed Honda's 70th anniversary, which would have been a perfect time to introduce such a car, and in 2017 Honda CEO Takahiro Hashigo said that a new Roadster was possible but would not be arriving any time in the near future. Therefore, in the meantime we must wait, and appreciate what we already have in the high-revving, stiff-chassied, convertible phenomenon that we know as the one and only Honda S2000. So that was a detailed history of the Honda S2000. I hope you enjoyed it and feel slightly more informed than you did 35 minutes ago. Thanks.